This is Let's Talk About, a digital CPD series for teachers. I am Dan Lyndon-Cohen. In the first episode on the topic, Let's Talk About Empire and Conflict, we talked about where there's room on the curriculum to teach the First and Second World War and Empire stories, and how to choose resources to support that teaching. In this episode, we're going to hear from Imperial War Museum historian Alan Wakefield about two sources in the IWM collection that could be used to support the teaching of many First World War lessons. These resources challenge us to think about how exactly we would talk about them in a classroom, and what concerns we have when we talk about resources that highlight explicit inequalities. Alan will meet with Funmi and renowned equality expert Dr. Halima Begum from the Runnymede Trust to decide on 3 top tips for teachers to keep in mind when talking about these kind of resources in the classroom.
My name's Alan Wakefield and I'm lead curator of First World War history at the Imperial War Museum. And today I'd like to introduce to you 2 object-led stories from the IWM collections that you might consider using if you are teaching British Empire history in the context of the First World War. Later I'll be joined by a panel of experts and we'll talk about actually using these resources in the classroom. The first story is outlined by these 2 posters. Now these are an English and a Burmese language version of the same poster, and they outline the support available for wounded Indian servicemen who served in the First World War, their families and next of kin. And this is in terms of pensions that are available, medical support and retraining for those badly wounded for new jobs. And if at first sight, when you look at this, it's very, very generous provisioning by the government of India and the Indian Army, and it does tend to show a real sort of duty of care to these ex-servicemen and their families. But we sort of need to look behind this for the sort of true story. So we need to consider, what was the political situation like in India in 1919? Well, following the First World War and some broken promises on greater Indian representation in government, there was growing resistance to British rule in India. And the Indian Army was a great part of the mechanism for maintaining British control. So the British authorities needed to keep the Indian Army and army families on side. So by offering this support to ex-servicemen, it showed that the Indian Army was important and was looking after them. So it was sort of tying them to the colonial system. And this is part of the whole divide and rule idea, which was an integral part of the whole colonial system that Britain and other countries ran to keep basically minority rule against the majority population. Secondly, we need to look at, well, who was actually offering this support? Well, in terms of the training facilities, these weren't offered by the government. They were offered by voluntary organisations and philanthropic individuals who were actually putting the money into these associations. So the government really wasn't having anything to do with that, but it was trading off the back of others' work. We also need to look at, well, how much actual provision was given. I mean, this is India-wide. So there's 65,000 badly wounded Indian servicemen after the First World War, and many of them live in remote rural areas, and it would be very difficult for them to travel to places where these very few training institutions are actually available. So for many, it was not a proper sort of offer. It was impossible for these men to go. And also we need to look at what was actually being given to them in terms of, say, prosthetic limbs. Were they being offered the most cutting edge limbs that were available, as was being offered to badly wounded British servicemen? On the whole, no, because there was a belief that the modern prosthetics of the day were not suitable for the rough, tough Indian rural lifestyle. And there was also a belief that the Indian ex-servicemen wouldn't look after them properly anyway. And that was just a thought by the authorities. There was no evidence behind that. Again, it's just basically a thought that they weren't worthy of these things because they wouldn't appreciate them. So there was also a lack of repair facilities. Which was another issue. So even though these men were given prosthetics, actually keeping them workable was impossible. So this is really a story where you have to look behind the glossy headlines to actually interpret what is available and to find out the truth. Second story revolves around this jacket. Now, this isn't a standard British Army jacket in the First World War. It's a different colour, different material, and it's a kind of jacket worn by African labourers who were working in support of the British Army behind the lines. Chief amongst these were the South African Native Labour Corps, about 25,000 men who joined and were serving behind the lines on the Western Front, doing lots of vital work, unloading ships, building camps, cutting timber and quarrying stone for road repairs, all vital work to keep the army functioning. Now, the fact that these men were wearing a different uniform probably means they have a different sort of military wartime experience. Particularly the case for South African Native Labour Corps. It was raised by South Africa for the war effort and run along very strict segregation lines. You've got to remember, South Africa at the time was ruled by the white minority, and what they didn't want is white and black South Africans serving side by side in a fighting combat role, as this would undermine the idea of white supremacy on which the government was based. So black South Africans joined this Labour Corps, which was never armed, and the South Africans ensured that they ran the show and made sure that these men were living in segregated camps. So they were kept away from Allied soldiers and even French and Belgian civilians. Again, they didn't want any new ideas coming back into South Africa which might undermine the ruling system. Also of interest about this jacket is the label and wax seal that's actually attached to the jacket. Now, this shows that it was what's called a sealed pattern, so it was never issued to an individual soldier or labourer. It was actually kept by the army as an example jacket, and it would be issued to any company that won a contract to actually produce hundreds or thousands of these jackets, and they'd have to be produced to exactly this style and in exactly this sort of quality. And that is what a seal pattern is. Now, interestingly, this label bears a derogatory term used at the time for black Africans, what we call the K word today. And this really shows the attitudes of the authorities towards these men, because this word doesn't have anything to do with the title of any African labour unit. So there's been a conscious decision to use this term as a catch-all term for African labourers. And if we look at that, if we look at the actual name of the South African Native Labour Corps, again, the word native is being used in a derogatory term towards the indigenous people of South Africa by the white ruling colonial elite in the country. Today, the K word that's on that label is enshrined under South African law as a hate term, and you can actually face a term of imprisonment for using that term.
So I'd like to say thank you to Alan for introducing us to two incredibly interesting objects, and it was definitely interesting to see sources like this used within the classroom when teaching Empire and Conflict. I feel honoured to be speaking with Alan this evening and to be able to introduce Dr. Halima Begum, who'll be joining us in a discussion surrounding the use of these sources in schools.
It's really a pleasure to be here with the Imperial War Museum today. So my name is Halima Begum, as you said. I am the CEO of the Runnymede Trust. The Runnymede Trust is the UK's leading race relations think tank. The jacket uses quite explicit racist symbols, if not racist language. And here I think you have to be historically accurate, because if you omit that history or the telling of that history, you're somehow favouring the racist, basically. So you don't want to do that. So you do have to be accurate and actually mention that the context of that source was that the army existed, but perhaps there are hierarchies and segregated ranks and so on, for example. So very explicitly, this is racist, but we are telling this history so that we have a better understanding of how South African black soldiers contributed to the British Empire. So I think in some ways it's actually easier to deal with the explicit racism because you can name it. What's harder, I think, is the second source with the poster, where we are looking at seemingly positive examples of how the British Empire was supporting Indian soldiers. And it almost looks jovial and positive and great. And it's a little bit like every time you have a conversation about the British Empire with some people, they'll say, oh, but the Brits left the railways behind in India, didn't they? And every Indian just sits there quietly, really uncomfortable, thinking, but what about all the trauma that you left behind? How about that? So somehow this poster, I think, shows a certain view of the British paternal way in which they managed administratively the Indian Empire. But what it doesn't show is that actually there was a lot of segregation, a lack of support, power differentials, different labour terms. So it seems as though things look paternalistically taken care of. But what we do know is that this is probably indentured servants. This is probably a part of the army that is not enjoying the same rights as British soldiers who are white in England. So I think those sources are interesting because they allow you to look at how you deal with a very explicit source that's racist and how you deal with implicit sources that don't appear to be racist, but it's hidden, it's unconscious, it's there, it's making everyone feel uncomfortable. And it might even be very useful to deal with those sources at the same time to show the difference.
I think at the moment there is a lot of debate surrounding what we should be teaching about empire and what we shouldn't be teaching. And I think it's really important to flip this entire narrative on its head and ask teachers to consider how they can feel confident in teaching lessons that kind of ignore the racism and inequalities of the British Empire, because actually these things really happened and it's something that should be acknowledged in school along with the rest of the subject. I think the very fact that these sources that Alan introduced exist should provide teachers with confidence in knowing that they're acknowledging a really important truth and that these things actually happened. Yeah, so I agree, and I think both of these sources would definitely be really useful to use in the classroom. But I think that before teachers use these, they need to think really carefully about the delivery and how they'd incorporate these into lessons. So I'd kind of, in terms of the jacket with the explicit language, I would be thinking mainly about the impact of this, and that's kind of twofold. So the first question that I'd be asking is, what could the impact of this source be on students within the class? And I think it's really important for teachers to understand that the racist language was always designed to be derogatory, and the impact that it had on individuals was to other and to dehumanise them at the time. And the impact of that language itself hasn't lessened over time. And if anything, I think because of its legacy and because of the understanding of that language, the impact has become more severe for people that it's directed towards. And so teachers need to consider that if that language is repeated within the classroom, the impact on any students who identify in that way is likely to be the same as the impact that was designed for the people that it was originally used to describe. And so I think I'd recommend doing some research into intergenerational trauma in order for teachers to prepare themselves to have these conversations within classrooms. In my opinion, there's absolutely no need for the language to be spoken out loud or to even be displayed on kind of the screen in the classroom. And instead, as a teacher, you can simply explain that horrible, offensive language was sewn into the label. And you can also articulate that language is so incredibly offensive that you as a teacher are not willing to repeat it. And I think that it would be much more impactful to see a teacher who's an authority figure actually making a clear stand against using that racist language than to hear them say it. Because I think if teachers are using that language in the classroom, they risk some students thinking that they can repeat that term, which is exactly what we want to avoid. So I think any emphasis that we can put on kind of the negative aspects of that language is really important in schools. It's really important for these discussions to be had, but by forcing students to endure racist language, you are losing the impact of what's actually a really important conversation. And for me as an adult, I still find it really difficult to hear certain racist terms. And I suppose I do have elements of trauma from that myself, so I would hate for kind of students in classrooms to be exposed to that on a regular basis without being offered lots of support surrounding that as well.
We shouldn't be airbrushing anything out of history just because it's difficult to deal with. We have to deal with difficult subjects. History is difficult, especially history of empires. And we have to talk about everybody's contribution.
Using these sources will open up difficult conversations about racism and about power structures. And these are really important conversations that I think can be had and also kind of controlled within school in a really safe environment.
It's important, I think, that we bring the level of sensitivity and awareness to the particular parts of history that we're teaching and having an understanding of who it is in this classroom that may well have been impacted by the history of the sources that we're describing.
It's really essential to kind of front load your lessons. It's something that I've learned, and to acknowledge straight away that students are going to hear kind of difficult topics addressed, and to ensure that from the outset they know that their feelings about this are completely valid. I think we should explain to students that we will be addressing racism and be open in kind of explaining that these conversations are uncomfortable but also really important. And it's really important to also signpost students to the areas in school that they can go to for support after the lesson if needs be. What we don't want is for students to completely shut down as a result of what is a really important but also a sensitive topic.
I suppose for me as a South Asian, I find it very difficult to use the P word, never mind the N word, never mind the K word. And I imagine that white educators would feel the same because they're even more removed, I think, from that community than I am. So that's appreciating, I suppose, the impact that we feel. You know, I am a grown up, I'm not a child, I'm not impressionable, but it has an impact on me still, and that's important. And the children's spaces are no different from adult spaces when they hear that word. So that trauma is very real. And I suppose if we were to have an educator who clearly says that this is unacceptable language and it's absolutely appalling that this happened, but we will talk through the historical context of why that happened, could be quite powerful. But equally, without saying that this was unacceptable, this was dehumanizing, the purpose of that language was to demean. Without doing that, but going into the kind of displaying of something that's offensive could be quite problematic, I think. So right from the outset, I think we have to stand up against that and say why it was so inappropriate, but then show that the historical context was such that it went unchallenged. This was seen as everyday practice, but it wasn't okay. It was designed to hurt and dehumanize.
I mean, connecting with that jacket, there is almost like a hierarchy of sort of demeaning terminology, because if you don't want to use the word that's on the label, the unit, the South African unit was associated, the guys who actually wore those jackets, the official title of the unit was the South African Native Labour Corps. So, and the idea is that the term native is being used basically to signify black South Africans. There were white officers in that unit, but at the end of the day, the soldiers were black South Africans. A white South African would not join that unit as an other rank, and that word is not used for any of the other labour units in the British Army. There's the Indian Labour Corps, there was the Egyptian Labour Corps. That wasn't used because the South Africans named that unit themselves, and the British didn't challenge the name of the unit. And then they allowed it to be run by the South Africans rather than by the British Army, which the other labour units were run by. So that's the story behind it. But you've also got that hierarchy of language. So perhaps you can introduce the word native because it's in the context of the unit rather than the word on the label.
So the word native is obviously a byword for somebody who's not white, and in that context we need to say how language can still be divisive when it seemingly seems quite neutral.
So we used to have a card index which was written up 1919, 1920s in really nice copperplate handwriting. But if you look at the index for soldiers, you have British troops, you have foreign troops, who's literally everybody else that's white. Then you have colonial troops, which are primarily Indian soldiers. Then you have, I think it's colonial auxiliaries, who are black African soldiers. And then you just have basically a card for natives, which is a card for like civilians from the colonies. Somebody was indexing those photographs back right at the end of the First World War, and they obviously came up with that hierarchy of that's how they were going to name troops.
Okay, so in terms of the kind of seemingly positive language used in the poster, I think that in schools we're pretty well versed in source analysis, and aside from the obvious caution I've described in terms of approaching topics regarding race, the poster source can be approached in a pretty similar way to usual. So for example, when we teach World War I and World War II, all schools generally teach propaganda anyway, and this source doesn't necessarily need to be treated differently. So for example, some schools use anagrams, some schools question the source's purpose or its origin or its nature or its date, and the same thing can apply here to analyse how truthful this depiction of events was. So obviously this would probably involve more teacher input than usual, and we encourage students to come up with a variety of inferences from sources usually. But in this case, I think it's important to bring the students back to an understanding that this poster was kind of intentionally designed to be misleading. So if you take it from the kind of viewpoint of it being propaganda, I think it would be really useful for students to pick this apart and kind of question, why is this language so positive? who were these benefits actually for. If this is linked into, as Alan said, the policy of divide and rule, then we need to encourage students to question that if this was what was being offered to these veterans, then what was simultaneously being denied to the rest of the population.
Yeah, I agree with that. It is a divide. It was basically a divide and rule thing. I mean, if you look at it, it's trying to get an important part of the community to stay on side, to buy into the whole empire. So the army, if you served in the army, there were benefits. So there are benefits of continuing British rule, and you're quite right that these services, etc., were available to people connected with army families, but they weren't available to anybody else. And also the fact the posters, I think they were printed in September 1919. Obviously, that's a few months after the Amritsar massacre and various things like this, where basically there is a growing resistance and fight back against British rule. And the idea is what you can't afford is for the army to go. If the army goes, that's the end of British rule, and we're dependent on basically local guys in the army to maintain British rule.
I think the wider context needs to be introduced around resistance, as you say, Alan, because there was a whole load of resistance going on. And why was that resistance going on? Maybe the colonial enterprise and its time was done. It's over. It was something that was obviously clearly coming to an end. And to see a poster used in that way during the kind of peak period of the movement around resistance and decolonization, I think it's also part of that critical teaching of history that educators need to tell their students. And if you leave that out, then you're kind of going with the kind of dominant narrative and the propaganda. It begs the question when educators ask us, well, is there ever any space to teach history and inclusive histories? I always think you don't need to artificially create more space. What you need to do is make sure you tell history accurately. And if you do the history accurately, there'll be the space. So I think we're colluding with a version of history by leaving out the resistance. So we need to make sure that we're critically displaying practically as many of that histories as we can. And history is not singular. There are different histories being told of the same period. My top tip is to keep things historically factual and accurate, because by omitting something that is seemingly offensive, I think we will favour the racist, not the anti-racist. So it's important that we are factual, we are accurate, and by doing so, we will actually bring in a more inclusive telling of history.
I think that it's our job as teachers to advocate historical accuracy always. It's our job to teach students the truth, and we are not in a position that we can just select bits of history that show Britain in a positive light. We have to be honest in that, and I think it's really, really important for us to acknowledge these instances of racism, because students need to understand that it happened, and also to be able to make links to the legacy of that today as well. I also think that we need to be obviously really wary of the importance of this topic, as well as the impact that this could have on students. And we need to front load our lessons to ensure that we are validating students' feelings about that, of which there will be many. We need to make sure that students feel open and comfortable in kind of discussing the way that these topics make them feel, as well as providing them with signposts for support and being incredibly careful with the language that we use, because as well as historical accuracy, we need to kind of protect our students in some senses as well.
In between that, I'd also probably say that it's something about creating a safe space and an enabling space in which these difficult conversations can take place. And the most effective way to do that, I think, is by not reinforcing any myth that such language, such sources were merely a part of their times, and somehow the inference being there, move on, because that was history and that's what it was. So I think by showing that it was unacceptable, as you were saying earlier, by challenging racism in front of our eyes or the way it was used, I think you role model the way in which young learners should be tackling racism in societies as they become adults.
Some teachers are under this illusion that we shouldn't be kind of bringing topics of racism into school because it can be damaging for students. But actually, if we ignore this problem within schools, that doesn't mean that students won't be exposed to it outside of school. And at least if we address kind of racism in terms of a historical sense and understand where it came from and kind of analyse what happened in the past, then we can also have discussions about what's currently happening, and we can teach students that it's wrong, rather than them kind of stumbling across racism outside of school and making entirely their own decisions about it. There are some things that we've got a responsibility to teach, and I really strongly believe that this is one of them.
But I wonder if there are other ways in which to make that topic less sensitive, seemingly for education purposes, and not to take away from the offence and the outrage and the trauma, but to allow the learning process to take place. I just think that it could be an opportunity to also bring in community members who never really had their experiences or their histories ever recounted in this country. And it's a bit about the intergenerational piece, isn't it? I think it could be quite powerful.
My top tip would be to be wary of the importance of this topic, as well as the impact that you could have on students. So front load your lessons with information about what's going to be covered in detail, and also to validate students' feelings and provide them with signposts for support, and just to be incredibly careful with the way that you discuss this topic.
My second tip then is about understanding that whenever we hear the phrase that's reinforced around, well, these were the sign of the times, this is what happened before, not to reinforce that, because it wasn't okay then. There was just nobody there to challenge it. If you take these tips, I think you'll open up a space for a conversation to take place that can actually handle any number of difficult, complex topics. And I think it's a sign of a more resilient kind of society if you're able to open up this conversation. Because as you say, Alan, this is about historical accuracy. It did happen. How do we now actually try and deal with what has been a contested history? And we're more resilient for it. So I think it's part of a mature process of a society coming together and healing, really. And this is where it starts in our classrooms, looking at our contested histories.
Wow, thank you Halima, Funmi and Alan for that fantastic discussion. So many really insightful and useful suggestions for working sources about empire and conflict. It was really clear from your final comment that there are some key takeaways that teachers can build upon. Firstly, I'd agree with Funmi that it's really, really important to prepare your students effectively before you engage with sensitive materials. And this can be embedded into your practice from year 7 onwards. It's also really important to acknowledge the power of the language that's been used in the past to dehumanise and segregate communities, and how that power still resonates and triggers some students today. So we have to be very careful to acknowledge the emotional impact on our students. Halima also made a critical point when she addressed the attitude that attempts to minimise the legacy and impact of racism by confining it to a distant time in the past. That was just how it was done in those days. This attitude needs to be challenged for a number of reasons. It ignores the many acts of resistance that challenge these racist attitudes across communities and across time. And this links to Alan's tip about the importance of teaching a history that is accurate, and a narrative that has omitted significant chunks of the story, wittingly or unwittingly, cannot be deemed worthy of study, especially in schools.